Well, here's our September webinar, guys, and we've got plenty of stuff to cover. Some of this stuff isn't a whole lot different from just the monthly video that I did, about a week and a half or so ago, but there are a couple of elements in here that I'd like to share that might prove fruitful going forward. So don't want to waste your time, so we'll just dig right into this as we always do. And in fact, it largely starts out with kind of where we are in terms of this weather pattern that we're dealing with across the Western United States. And these are precipitation anomalies for the past 30 days. And you can see for the most part, the monsoon has been starting to calm down. So you see a little dry pocket there around the Four Corners area, which will largely go away with the rain that's been happening over the past couple of days, and they have another round of rain headed our way tonight and into tomorrow. But in general terms, you could see even the Pacific Northwest has been fairly dry over the past 30 days or so. Nothing huge that stands out at you, but there are definitely some dry anomalies. If you look in the northeast of Mexico, the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas, and even up into southeast Colorado, we've got some issues going on right there. We still have La Nina firmly in place. These are current sea surface temperature anomalies. So you can see all of that blue that extends in the same regions we've been talking about now, from northeast of Australia all the way back to the west coast of South America. The other thing that's been noticeable here is the north central Pacific has been starting to cool off a little bit too, which is typical this time of year as we start to get some bigger storms to make their way through the Pacific. And we had remnants of a typhoon go up into the Aleutian Islands. That likely has contributed to some of those cooler temperatures up there. But bottom line, the main player here is the ongoing La Nina and the overall cool state of the Pacific Ocean. And that's just something that's been dominant now for the past 2+ years. La Nina looks still pretty likely through the winter. This is actually the mid-September update from the IRI model-based probabilities. And you can see we really don't have a whole lot of change that's likely going to take place through the majority of this winter. Now, if you look at the January, February, March season right there, you see those probabilities drop below 50% for La Nina continuing. I think that that's probably when we'll have the best opportunity to see a transition out of this La Nina and possibly at least just go to more neutral conditions during the heart of 2023. And then if you look on the far right side of the graphic, that's May, June, July, you start to see El Nino probabilities come up there to about 25 or 30%, which would be an indication that there could be some sort of a transition taking place there. This is an interesting thing that I've been following, and I'm going to have more on here in just a little bit to kind of tie all this together. But a couple of things here. It really isn't just about La Nina going away, all right? We need the overall state of the Pacific to warm up somewhat because that'll do a couple of things. It will kind of bring us back more toward a neutral setting, number one, and it will also allow the potential for us to swing more toward an El Nino episode. I really don't care if we go El Nino or La Nina during that time. I would be more interested in us just getting back to the 0 point where some of these weather patterns could actually come through in a more average fashion, if you will. But to do that, we have to warm up the PDO. If we lose La Nina for a little bit and we still have a cold PDO, it doesn't necessarily reset the table. But I'll show you why that's important here in just a little bit. But if nothing else, the mid-September update here was an interesting one because we're starting to see those La Nina probabilities drop during wintertime, and then some El Nino probabilities possibly returning as we head toward late spring and next summer. If we look at the probability of our precipitation forecast over the next 15 days, the anomaly forecast that is, this is what we're looking at. So you've got dry pockets in the Pacific Northwest. You're looking fairly dry across Wyoming, dry eastern New Mexico, most of Texas. But there in the Four Corners area, that green anomaly right there is largely tied to what is going on right now. Again, this model came out today, so it's building that in. After we get past this event that's currently going on, bringing some good rains from Arizona, southeast Utah, northwest New Mexico, and southwest Colorado, things dry out quite a bit after that. If we want to take it a step further, and we'll switch models here to the GFS over the next, say, month, well, then you get something that's eventually going to look like that. You can see it's got that wet pocket there, southwest Colorado, back through the Four Corner states, but the rest of the region is pretty dry. And some of those dry anomalies are fairly significant too, especially from the Pacific Northwest and also out into the midsection of the country where we haven't seen anything major come out as of yet in terms of a late summer or fall-like storm. And the model does not see that happening, at least for the next, say, month or so. Does that mean it can't happen? No, we can get a storm to come in, but the overall trend here with this model is much like the other models, and it's much like it should be. When you've got a La Nina going on right now, this is what you should actually see. These are the analog years for the current situation. By current situation, I'm saying the cold PDO and the La Nina that's going on right now. So all of those years that I have listed up there, that's what we were seeing during those years from October through December. You might say, well, that's just the next 3 months. What lies beyond that? Well, you got to be patient about this. What happens later this winter is huge in determining where we go for the majority of 2023. So with this particular map right here, I want you to eat what's in front of you first, because from October through December, we're painting some pretty big time dry anomalies across Texas, parts of the Western High Plains, and an interesting one is Northern California during that time. I'm not terribly concerned about that anomaly out there, but it is something that is interesting, because I'm gonna show you why that is when this La Nina transition takes place, why that kind of comes into the fray. But if you're looking for some analog years to at least get us through the fall and the majority of the winter season, those are the years that you can actually look to. And you might say, well, there's also a lot of white there that's on the map. That's right. Indicating generally average conditions, because there are some La Ninas in the past that have been wetter than average and some that have been drier than average for those areas that are in white. And when you average that out, well, you get average. But for the areas that are yellow, red, orange, more oftentimes than not, the La Nina and the negative PDO or the cold PDO has produced drier than average conditions. Climate Prediction Center forecast for the next 3 months also shows that very clearly. You see a little bit of an uptick in moisture in the Pacific Northwest. You see that dry anomaly across parts of California, and you also see a pretty substantial dry anomaly across parts of the Southern Plains and the Mississippi Valley. That pushes back to the Northwest into the Northwest High Plains. Again, nothing groundbreaking to show here. It is what it is, and it's dry where it's supposed to be dry, and that's kind of what the models are showing us, at least in the near term. The latest NMME model, again, I showed you this about 10 days or so ago. You could see where these dry anomalies are. So for October, it's painting those dry anomalies exactly where they should be, where all that brown is located. If we look at the month of December, or I should say November, it's basically the same story. Fall, La Nina episodes during the fall season are drier than average in those places. And you see some dark brown right there, those dry anomalies, or at least the percentage chances that those areas are going to be below average in terms of moisture are pretty robust, upwards of 60 to 70%. So that's the model having some pretty high confidence. Meanwhile, you've got some moisture going on in the Pacific Northwest, and that's kind of a prelude to how this transition takes place during the wintertime when you have La Nina present. So you see all that green that unfolds up there, northern Utah, northern Nevada, northern west and northwest Colorado, all the way up into the northern Rockies. That's where the storm track is historically more active when we have a La Nina going on. Meanwhile, you beat back that dry anomaly farther south. So the model is suggesting during the month of December, the storm track could get a little bit more active and the weather pattern could obviously become a bit more variable. That would also coincide with La Nina gradually starting to step down. I didn't say go away, but gradually starting to possibly step down. Month of January, you've got dry anomalies running across most of California, the desert Southwest, into most of Texas. Meanwhile, you've got wet anomalies going on across the northern tier of the country. Again, that's where the storm track is likely to be the most active, not even just in the January, but also February. You don't see a whole lot of change right there, where the dry and the wet anomalies are actually taking place during that time. So if you looked at the NMME and you're like, man, parts of California are looking to be, drier than average again for what would be the third consecutive year or whatnot during the part of the wet season. And that would be a real problem. I don't want you to necessarily take that to the bank just yet. And I'll show you why in just a moment. But even in the month of March, we beat back the dry anomaly in California. The northern tier of the country, even into the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, they stay active. Farther south you go, you've got some dry stuff in the Four Corners area that eventually goes away as we head into April. And during the month of April, this model suggests that the La Nina would be weakening back toward more of a neutral type setting. So you don't have these monstrous dry anomalies. Plus, you still have pretty active storm track going on during the month of April, and that could lead to some better precipitation potential later in the year. But I'd be lying if I'd say I wasn't necessarily that concerned about the December, January, February for parts of California for those reasons that I had mentioned. If we look at the Euro seasonal model, it's painting a very similar type forecast in terms of dry anomalies. There's October. You can see parts of the Southern Plains, Mississippi Valley, Missouri Valley on up into the Great Lakes. And then you also have stuff going on farther west and northwest. And then when you get into November, it really bullseyes the southeast half of the country. And you see an uptick going on in the moisture in the farther northwest you go, Pacific Northwest, parts of California, where you might see a little bit of an active storm track during the course of that month. And then it starts to shrink a little farther to the northwest. You see those bigger anomalies up there across western Washington and Oregon, also across parts of Idaho, versus the farther east and southeast you go, those dry anomalies really start to show up. Eastern New Mexico, parts of southern Colorado, and points farther to the east. Again, that is for December. If you look at January, again, the farther north you go, more active storm track. But you see a large part of Southern California shut out, and those dry anomalies extend eastward across Arizona, New Mexico, and into Texas. And then you see an uptick in moisture. Once you get into the Mississippi and Ohio Valley, that's kind of where the storm track picks up the moisture, and you actually start to see storminess farther east versus the farther southwest you go. You kind of get shut out with that kind of a pattern. And in February, much the same. You have wet anomalies, far northern California, the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, also the parts of the Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley, and then in the middle, you have that dry anomaly that extends up through the plains. So the NMME model, the Euro model, not exactly on the same page, but in theory, they have kind of the same theme here. They both know that La Nina is going to play a role this winter. They both know that La Nina is here and fairly strong right now. So that's what they're basing their forecast on. These particular models, when they initialize on a particular thing, become harder and harder to trust the farther you go out in time because things change. All right. And I think one of the main drivers in this long range forecast has the opportunity to change once we get into the springtime. And that one thing is the La Nina episode. And you see even into the month of March, kind of what you see is what you get. Dry in the middle. We've got wet anomalies going on in the Ohio and parts of the Mississippi Valley, and you've got wet anomalies across far northern California and the Pacific Northwest. That's exactly where it should be wetter than average during a La Nina, and exactly where it should be drier than average during a La Nina. So the model is playing their cards really close to their vest in terms of what they have initialized on and where they're going forward, if that makes sense. The IRI model, again, this is October, November, December. You see where it paints the most stout dry anomalies across the southern tier of the country. You've got some average to slightly wetter than average pockets across parts of the west. But that dry anomaly that's in the midsection really gets beat back here for December, January, and February. So again, you see average to slightly wetter than average across parts of the northwest and drier than average across the southern tier. In the middle, generally average speaking, because the storm track may be able to dip far enough south to clip places that might otherwise be dry. But in theory, models are pretty much on the same page, having dry south and wetter than average the farther north you go. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation, okay? You hear me talk about this a lot. It's the state of the Pacific. When we have a warm phase, El Ninos are favored. When you have a cold phase, La Ninas are favored. Well, we've been cold PDO now for the past, several years for the most part, and really cold PDO for about the past 2 years. So I want to walk you back to 2013 and 2014. When we finished 2013, over here on the left-hand side of the graph, you see where the PDO was. It was down there to about negative 1.6. And then look what happened to the PDO there as we wrapped up 2013 and went into 14. It didn't necessarily go gangbusters warm early on, but it hovered around neutral territory before it really took a big step in late 14 and started to flex in a warmer or more positive fashion. And that warm and positive fashion lasted for late 2014, 2015, and a large part of 16 before we went right back down into the cool stuff, okay? Now, 15, 16, that was a big El Nino event right there. So I'm not saying that the transition that we could see here coming up is going to be identical to something like this, but I at least think the discussion should be on the table. For the reason that the PDO has been cold, and in some cases record cold for a while now, and historically speaking, when we come out of that, we go back to neutral and possibly even toward warmer, somewhat slightly positive PDO. So you might ask yourself, well, what happened with the weather pattern during that period of time? These are the precipitation anomalies for October, December of 2013. Okay, so as we finish 2013, you see what happened right there. Again, La Nina was away, but the PDO was still cold. So you see what happened out there. You had some pretty stout dry anomalies out there across large part of the West. The northern tier of the country, once across the Dakotas, parts of Montana, Wyoming, was wetter than average, and then you had dry anomalies across parts of the center portion of the country. Not unprecedented when we look at the way things were set up then. So let's go further here and see how it changed once we headed into 14. January to May of 2014 looked like that. Again, with the PDO still somewhat suffering from a negative hangover right there. You had dry in the center. You were wet in the Pacific Northwest, you were dry across parts of the West and Southwest, and you were wetter than average along parts of the Gulf Coast and Southeast. I think that was somewhat of an anomaly, but you get the idea. It wasn't until the back half of 2014 that we really flipped the script. You see that? That was the first half of 2014. But if we go to the second half of 14, it looks completely different across a large part of the country. There are still some dry pockets in East Texas, Gulf Coast or whatever, but for the most part, the entire Western United States recovered from nasty drought and enjoyed a period of time there where we were not only going in a warm PDO, but we were headed toward a pretty stout El Nino where we really made things wetter than average across the Western United States. So am I ready to go this route yet? All right, not just yet. I would like to see a lot more evidence before me that would suggest that the PDO is going to flip from a cold to a warm phase. If I see that happening, it's going to give me a lot more confidence in looking at this transition for those areas. But if I had to recall a recent time in history where we went through that triple dip La Nina and came out of it like this, it was 2010, 11, 12, and we saw the transition take place during the back half of 13 and into 14. So for everybody that wants analogs, I gave you the basic analog early on, where we're dealing with the La Nina episode in this cold PDO. Where we could possibly go is what you're looking at right here. Does that mean we're going to have an immediate El Nino? No, I'd like to get farther down the road before I would even discuss that. But if you want to gamble on something with your PRF stuff, and then look to this analog, because that's possibly where we could go. That's a pretty tough sell to folks that have been dry. All right, and I always recommend folks take advantage of the PRF program. I don't care if you spread those percentage points through the various intervals. In my country here, in the Western High Plains, we're dry a lot of the time anyway. So you might as well shotgun your percentages out there and see what you get. But if you were going to load up certain intervals, I would say that you probably ought to do that during the first part of the year, because this might indeed be what it looks like during the back part of the year, if you get it. Those are my thoughts today, guys.
Thanks, Brian. So I got a few questions. So you said you're not quite ready to sign off on this just because you want to see some changes before you feel pretty confident about it, right?
Yeah, I would. I mean, we're that's my one problem with the guys that I talk to about these analogs, and I'm like, look, you can look through history and you can paint them out there, but you're never going to find that perfect analog. You're just not, especially when we're talking about some sort of an epic transition from what we're seeing right now. I mean, that PDO is still cool. So like I said, it's not just about the La Nina going away. It's about the PDO recovery. And the reason why I wanted to show this to you is because if you're looking to point to a recent time in history where we had a triple dip. Well, we did do that in late 10, 11, 12, and still hung over on for part of it, at least in the spring of 13. And then where you would go after that, this analog shows up. And I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that this happens. However, to the folks that I talk to on a regular basis, they're like, damn, I've been dry for 3 years here, and you're telling me that we're immediately going to come out of this and transition toward wetter than normal conditions. I don't know a whole lot of people that want to necessarily bet on something like that with what they've been dealing lately. However, if they're asking the question, and they do, I don't like to sit on the fence about it. So I want to show them some evidence about where we could possibly go. It's much easier to deal with what you're dealing with in front of you. It's more certain. And by more certain, I'm like, look, you got a cold PDO and you got a La Nina going on. That has to change before we can even talk about this. Yeah. I know PRF deadline's December 1st, so we have a little bit of time to watch this. We've got October, November. Do I think the PDO is going to blink during those months? Probably not, but we'll have 2 more model runs come in that look and see how things are evolving that could possibly give us more confidence into looking at this particular analog and giving us at least a little bit more credence to what we would be going to.
Yeah, that brings up a question that I was going to ask you before we finished up, and that was, so we're slated to do another one of these November 3rd. So we're just over a month away from that. What type of changes do you expect to see, or could we see between now and then? I mean, from our standpoint, we want to get folks signed up so we're not cramming everybody at the last of the deadline. But I know a lot of folks really want to watch this and have a pretty good idea of what we think is going to happen next year.
I think the change that we would see is if the La Nina starts to weaken during that time. Remember, historically speaking, we lose La Nina in the spring and summer, and then it comes back in the fall. Well, we haven't lost it. It's been going gangbusters now for months. So if it's already maxed out, and maybe once we get into November, maybe it starts to weaken a little bit. If it starts to weaken during November, that would give me a lot more confidence in pointing to something like this, because it would be weakening sooner than it historically should be weakening. All right, if we're weakening this La Nina 4 months or so ahead of schedule, then I would say, you know what, let's look at that analog and see that this possible transition, the chances of it happening are greater than what we talked about, during the month of September. So that's what I'm looking for going forward. The model data, you can sprinkle that in if you wish, but as I said, these models are initializing on something that's occurring right now and projecting that out going forward. Are they going to be 100% accurate? No, far from it. But if they're also showing that La Nina weakening, maybe the PDO warms up a little bit there. I don't think it's going to, but maybe it does. And if that happens, that's another piece of the puzzle that we could look at going forward. So bottom line, what I'm getting at is we need some evidence here that would support this analog going forward. It's a pretty good analog, I'm not going to lie, because I do think that there will be some sort of a transition happen. But we have to lose La Nina, and then we have to warm the Pacific for us to really take advantage of the transition.
And really, at this point, it's how long it will take for that to start happening.
That's right.
Yeah.
That those water temperatures don't change overnight. I mean, you're talking about the size of a body of water of the Pacific Ocean and those ENSO regions out there. You have to have some things happen before you can fully sign off on something like that.
So everybody on the West Coast needs to throw their heaters in the ocean. See what we can do. Well, Brian, thanks again for this, and we'll look forward to the November get together and see what types of shifts we might have. We did do another giveaway as part of this webinar, as we call it, and so through the random selector, we picked Sherry Kimber as the winner of the vaccine cooler. So we'll be getting in touch with you about that. And right now, then, before we shut her down, we want to give a chance for anybody who wants to ask specific questions to Brian. You can throw it in the chat, or you can, I guess actually, let's see, yeah. Probably the best to throw it in the chat if you've got something. Otherwise, I gotta unmute everybody.
Yeah. I got chat up too, so we can.
Yeah. So we'll let you guys think on that for a few minutes. I know sometimes it takes a minute to come up with something. So I'm gonna maybe try while people are thinking real quick, Brian, to kind of reiterate. So we're looking status quo through the next few months into January of dryness, with potential shifts, not sure what scale as we come into spring is kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and I would just say that, you know, we're coming up on the seasonal change here too. So there's always going to be some variability go on. You know, just because we've seen a pattern that's produced dryness doesn't mean we can't have storms. Okay.
Right.
But the overall trend that you're looking at, I mean, you saw the end of 2013 was brutal. You know, if we go back to that map here, okay, you can see what the end, it'll pop up here in just a second. Things are running a little slower. That was October through December of 2013. All right. So you had, again, a large part of the West was in pretty rough shape during that time. And that coincides with when the PDO was still pretty negative. And then you went into spring, the first half of 2014, and you could see that things were more like what they should, you know, somewhat wetter than average in the Northwest, dry in the center part of the country, still lingering hangover from that negative PDO and that triple dip La Nina. But after we saw that full shift take place, you see what the transition was like right there. So I don't want to say, well, we're not going to get any storms at all. No, but I will say this: the farther south you go, that's when you could have some real problems that linger into at least the first half of 2014, because we saw that historically speaking, and that's also what a cold PDO or a La Nina produces. The one thing that changes that is if we gradually lose the La Nina and we get a southern branch of the jet stream kick in, that would also be another one of those pieces of the puzzle that would give me confidence into going into something like this. So, you know, what I'm trying to do here is take something that is dependent on so many variables at such a long range and make it resonate and make it make sense. And that's a very tough thing to do. Okay. Especially when you've been dealing with what we've been dealing with over the past couple of years, because the analogs for the past couple of years, hey, we did all right with that. All right. But when you change that, you get even more variability. You get even more noise, if you will, in the patterns. So you have to kind of sort through that. It takes a little bit of time to do that, but you know, we'll get there.
Yeah, and I like the way you presented this, in that if you want to know what to gamble on, this is what we're looking at. But that's if you're a gambling man. Otherwise, you know, because maybe stick with the long-term averages that the software uses or whatever. But
yeah, exactly. And I think that's an important point, because if someone says, well, I don't want to do PRF this year, I'm like, great, do you. There are very few exceptions in my country or my part of the country where I tell folks not to do PRF, because as I said, it's dry at some point during the time. There are weather patterns that we get into that I would say, you know what, it's going to be wetter than average. You know, one of those years was 2015. I would tell people, look, we don't have any problem with moisture here in 2015. I would not waste my money. However, even in 2015, there were a couple of times where we went through a couple of dry stretches. So those years that I tell people not to do PRF, at least here in the Western High Plains, are very they're very few and far between.
And especially when you consider they're based off really pretty long-term averages of data. So
of course, you know, the data doesn't lie. 80% of the time you're going to do okay, you know, with something involved with PRF.
Yeah.
Another 20%, great. You know what though? If I can shoot 80% and win and give myself a little more opportunity to get gather some more income on something like that when it's going to be dry, I'll take that, you know.
Yeah, those are pretty good odds.
Every day of the week. I'll take that every day of the week. Yep.
All right, well, we've given everybody a chance to put in some questions. We haven't really had any come through. So looks like we'll just let everybody get back to their evening. Thanks again, Brian, and we'll touch base again in a little over a month.
You got it, guys. Be well.
All right, thank you.
You got it.